Very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to what is the eighth session in our webinar series. Hard to believe we're already on our eighth. But based on just that little quick friendly warm-up chat that I had with our presenters today, I think today we're going to have a hopefully quite a lively session on visual mapping and using that as part of your research. My name's Jonathan. I'm from the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership, and our Deputy Director, Angeline Barrett, is also here with us today to help chair some of these discussions that we'll be having. So if you've been to one of these sessions before, you know the drill. 20-minute presentation followed by 5 minutes or so of Q&A, and then moving on to the next speaker. And then if we've got time towards the end, then we'll go into a more general Q&A. So the chat feature is turned off for this meeting, but we do have the Q&A feature where we encourage you to drop questions throughout the session. If you do want to raise your virtual hand and ask questions that way through your mic, yeah, like I said, please do just raise that virtual hand and I will unmute you. This session is recorded. There is also an automatically generated caption feature if you would like to use that. But without further ado, I think I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Professor Peter Turnbull, Professor of Management at the University of Bristol. Over to you, Pete.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Has that gone? Yeah, okay. Is that okay? Everybody can see that? Okay, so yeah, I'm Professor Peter Turnbull. I'm in the business school at Bristol. My background is economics, but I mainly do work around on the labour market and work employment organisations. So I'm going to talk about work that I've been doing in particular with one of my former PhD students, Hugh Thomas, who's now Associate Professor at University College Dublin. Hugh, along with all my other students, is put to the task of drawing his PhD. So when I get to the stage where my PhD students are writing up, I found a seminar room with lots of whiteboards and asked the students to draw their PhD, which can be quite a challenge, and students do it in lots of different ways. They start in different places. Some start with the research questions, some start with their data, but it's the idea of kind of trying to map out visually what the PhD looks at and how you get from a research question to collecting data to analysing the data and writing up. So when we think about maps and mapping, we tend to think about a geographical map, a two-dimensional map, which shows the kind of relative place of for example, different countries. So you draw a map and you can see that the UK is closer to Europe than it is to America. But maps are also very useful visualization tools in different ways. And we also think about maps as a kind of a route map, a direction. These days, everybody just goes on their phone and, Google or AI does it for you. But in the old days, we used to open up a map book to work out what route we were going to take from A to B. And in most publications, at the end of an introduction, authors will give you a route map. They'll tell you, what's coming next, how they will get through, through their paper to get to the kind of to get to the answer. So this is one of the kind of visual representations that we find a lot in business management, looking at organizations, where people draw out the organizational structure. We call these organograms. When I joined Bristol in 2015, I joined the School of Economics, Finance and Management. That quickly became three separate schools: School of Economics, School of Accounting and Finance, and a School of Management. The School of Accounting and Finance was then put together with the School of Management to create a business school. So you might say, why did we go from one school to three schools to two schools? And the answer to that is that if they created a business school immediately, a lot of our colleagues in finance would have stayed in economics, and the university didn't want that. So by drawing out kind of organizational maps over time, it gives us some of the indications of the kind of process and the politics of things. So this is the the organizational structure of the International Labour Organization, which is one of the specialist agencies of the United Nations, actually predates the United Nations. The ILO is the only tripartite organization within the United Nations. So it has representation from governments, employers and workers. So all the big international meetings of the ILO, from any particular country, the government will send 2 representatives, the employers will send 1 representative, and workers will send 1 representative. The Director General of the International Labour Organization historically has been somebody who's been in public service, maybe a diplomat, an ambassador, somebody who's high up in the legal profession. Guy Ryder was the first Director General of the ILO from a trade union background. So Guy Ryder was formerly the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. So on the left-hand side is the organizational structure that Guy Ryder inherited. On the right-hand side is how he restructured the organization. So if you look at the first diagram under social dialogue, you'll see those 2 groups, the employers' activities and the workers' activities, which on the right-hand diagram, you'll see a kind of elevated to a direct line of reporting to the Director General. You'll also see under social dialogue on the left-hand diagram, sectoral activities. Most trade unions are organised on a sectoral or industrial lines. So Guy Ryder wanted to separate those out as to become a separate department and give them a more kind of direct line to him as the Director General. So by looking at organisational charts, you get some idea of the kind of politics and the kind of the way in which an organisation works. This is a more traditional map. It's a map of Scotland. And in Scotland, all the air traffic control in the Highlands and Islands is performed by the Highlands and Islands Airports Limited. It's an organisation owned by the Scottish Government, but run on a kind of commercial basis. The company proposed closing the towers, the airport towers, at a lot of these smaller airports, and going from a control tower where a person stands in a tower and looks out of a window, a 3D world, giving instructions to pilots, to a control center, a remote control center, where you're actually looking at a big computer screen. I mean, these screens can be 2 meters high, 4 or 5 meters wide. There are cameras in all these different airports, sound sensors, etc. And so you move all these air traffic controllers to one control center, and because they're not very busy, they can, you can spread the labor around, if you like. This proposal from Heil did not go down well with the community. It didn't go down well with the trade union Prospect that represents air traffic controllers, nor did it go down well with members of the Scottish Parliament. So what you see on the right-hand side are these 4 main actors: the community, the union, the company, and the government. And then we look at how these things changed over time and look at different phases to the point where the Scottish Parliament eventually voted this out, and the Heil decided not to proceed with the programme, and the chief executive lost his job. So this is the difference between what we call variance analysis, where we know that. So we know that X is correlated with Y when we conduct a regression analysis, for example. So I might run an equation with lots of different variables in, and I know whether those variables are statistically significant. I know whether the relationship is positive or negative, and I know the sign of the coefficient, how much work each variable is doing. Correlation is not causality. Process theory is we know how we got from A to B. So we could imagine a scenario where a company has an initial strategy, let's call it a quality, maximizing quality, high quality strategy. Over time, they focus more on cost minimization. So how do they go from strategy 1 to strategy 2? What are the different events, the activities, the strategic decisions that are made as part of that process? This is based on, process analysis is based on the work of Anne Langley and colleagues, and I would strongly recommend looking at some of these, some of her publications. So visual mapping sits in the kind of middle of these different sense-making strategies that we use. So sometimes we have a narrative that we write everything down about what happened, why it happened, who said what to who, where, when, why, etc. That is a very accurate account of what happened, but it's not a very simplistic account. You know, there's lots of detail, and it's difficult then to generalize from that particular case to other cases. Quantification is at the other extreme. Less accurate, but very simple, or much simpler, and we can generalize. So, for example, we might have a hypothesis that says firms that have a high quality strategy over time, because of competition or other factors, might gravitate towards a low cost strategy, and people could then test that out in other scenarios. Visual mapping sits in the middle of these sense-making strategies, where we often kind of bracket the data into different periods. And we then might use different frameworks, different theories, different models to try and explain what's going on at different points in time, these alternative templates that we might apply. So I'm going to show you how we do this in practice through research. This is work that, as I said, I did with one of my PhD students, Hugh Thomas. Hugh, when we got the money for his ESRC through the Economic and Social Research Council for his PhD, we actually built into that a 6-month internship at the International Labour Organization in Geneva. He was then offered a job there for a year, so he took suspension of studies. They then offered him another year, and he then changed the kind of focus, the sectoral focus of his research. So what we have here is the idea of different strategic action fields. So there are different action fields in terms of how we regulate the international economy. What the International Labour Organization does, the big circle in the middle, is it sets international labour standards. So we have labour standards on child labour or preventing child labour, forced labour, health and safety. The last convention adopted by the International Labour Organization, Convention 190, was on prevention of sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. The way things traditionally worked was that the employers and the workers would discuss an issue on health and safety, for example, and then whatever they agreed, the government would just basically ratify that. So what we have in this middle circle is the International Labour Office, the kind of civil service, all the people who work for the ILO, working with the employers, the workers, and the government. But the main kind of interaction is between the employers and the workers historically. We then have all these international socio-economic institutions, international financial institutions, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, European Union, North American Free Trade Agreement, and then other United Nations agencies. So you can think about how the ILO would work with the World Health Organization during the COVID pandemic to protect people's jobs or maybe subsidize jobs, etc. On the right-hand side, we have private labour governance. So we have human rights organizations, civil society organizations, and big multinational corporations that will have a code of conduct, for example, where they will, have nice warm words about protecting the environment, not employing children, all those kind of things. So what we did in this particular study, we drew on Michael Burawoy's theory of ethnographic revisits, the way in which we go back to organizations over time, and we look at, how the organization might have changed. So we did this by looking at 3 different Director Generals of the ILO. The first work I did with the International Labour Organization was back in 1999, just as Michael Hansen, he was a Belgian lawyer, was finishing his term of office. At the time, there were negotiations for China to be admitted to the World Trade Organization. There was lots of concern, in particular from civil society organizations, about the impact that would have on jobs. China's a very big economy. Wages are much lower, employment standards are lower, so people feared that jobs might be lost. Michael Hansen tried to bring these civil society organizations into the International Labour Organization in order to try to get a social clause adopted by the World Trade Organization, so that if you become a member of the World Trade Organization, there are kind of social obligations that go with that. Didn't work. Juan Samavoa basically reframed international labour standards as decent work. And the thing about decent work is that everybody can agree that workers should have a decent job. But what does that mean? And so workers, employers, and governments will have a different interpretation of what constitutes a decent job. So here we've seen that, we're drawing the circles they're all kind of interacting with the office, but they're all kind of separate. They've all got their own interpretation. And the main focus of the office was trying to get the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, other international agencies to kind of adopt this idea of decent work, which in its sense was quite successful in terms of, you know, the term decent work did find its way into all these documents, but it was interpreted in very different ways by different organizations. During this time, I was kind of going back and forth doing different projects with the International Labour Organization. I spent 3 months there as a visiting academic fellow. So we call this the punctuated revisit, where you work on a project, then you do something else, then you kind of go back again. So it's this kind of idea of a back and forth. So the ethnographic revisit is in a kind of punctuated pattern. Guy Ryder, as I said, was the first trade union or the first Director General with a trade union background. Guy Ryder's approach was that this is the International Labour Organization. So Guy Ryder's approach was to work very closely with the workers group and try and bring enough governments on board to try to get a new standard for global supply chains. So if you take a company like Nike, for example, all their clothes might be designed in America, but they'll be manufactured in Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, all these kind of places. So their target was transnational corporations who now dominate the world economy. You know, your Apple iPhone, for example, might be designed in California, but it's basically made in China or elsewhere by companies like Foxconn. So they wanted a convention that would place more responsibility on the big Western firms that were subcontracting in these other countries. And there was a particular political opportunity presented by a factory collapse in Bangladesh that killed over 1,000 workers. And it was found that the factory was producing for a lot of these kind of Western brands. So basically, Guy Ryder was trying to work much more closely with the workers and try and persuade enough governments to vote in favour of a new international labour standard for global supply chains. So what that then allows us to do is to look at these different general secretaries and to look at, you know, what their kind of main objectives were. So if I just take the second from bottom row, the framing strategy. So we think about framing as a way of, we all have our own frame of reference. That's how I see the world. When I talk about framing, that's how I want you to see the world. So people will frame things in a particular way to persuade others. What Michael Hansen was trying to do was build bridges with these civil society organizations. What Wan Samavo was trying to do was adopt a more kind of pluralist, decent work agenda that everybody could buy into. Nice warm words, but then it becomes more difficult to kind of put that into actual action. What Guy Ryder was about was more about internal reframing, this reorganization of the ILO and trying to reframe what the ILO does in terms of an international labour organization. So if we look at something like the attempt to have a global labour supply convention, sorry, not global labour supply, a global supply chain convention, you can map out the process that this goes through. So somebody identifies a problem. Western companies are subcontracting in Asian economies, developing countries, and working conditions in those countries are substandard. There might be child labour, forced labour, discrimination, all kinds of health and safety violations. So the governing body will then try to put that on the agenda of the International Labour Conference. Reports will be prepared. The International Labour Conference might agree to further research and the development of a convention, which they will, which the office will try to negotiate with the different groups, and then you try and vote on that. So the way in which we can think about this decision-making process is through there's a political theorist called Stephen Lukes who talks about the three faces of power. So where you're trying to get to at the International Labour Conference, where you've got the governments, the workers, and the employers, is you're trying to get a vote on a convention, which if passed, then countries would ratify that and enforce it through their own law. To do that, you've got to get that on the agenda. To get it onto the agenda, you might have to change the way we talk about these things. So, for example, during these discussions, the employers refuse to talk about global supply chains because the word chains indicates some kind of connection between things. And so the employers would say, no, these things are more like a bowl of spaghetti. We just had a vote in the Scottish Parliament on assisted dying, not assisted suicide, assisted dying. So we have to change the language so that people will talk about it, get it onto the agenda, and then get to a stage where we have a vote. That particular vote went against the proposals on assisted dying in the Scottish Parliament. It's likely that similar legislation in the UK Parliament will follow a different kind of, will arrive at a different outcome. So by mapping these things out, we can look at how these things change over time and look at different periods of time. We can bracket these things, then we can think about what is it that, what explains how something gets onto the agenda. A new general secretary, the Rana Plaza disaster, the reorganization of the organization. So we can look at these things over time, look at the activities of those different groups and see how we get to a particular outcome. Spoiler alert, in this particular case, the employers beat back the attempt by the ILO to pass the Global Labour Supply Convention. So we still don't have a convention like that. So what mapping does, by drawing these things out, drawing out the processes, it helps us to think about how we might look at how things change over time. And it might make us think about how we have to explain things, how things work differently in different time periods, maybe with different director generals or different opportunities that come along that people can take advantage of. So mapping, I think mapping is a really interesting way of, just writing things down, drawing things on boards. It doesn't always have to be like a map. It can be flowcharts, things like that, that really give you an insight into what might be going on in an organisation, and how and why things have changed over time. I'll stop sharing.
Right, that's lovely. Thank you so much, Pete. Drawing from quite, it seems, a long career of quite different research projects. I don't see any questions yet, so I will invite you to either drop questions in the Q&A section, or if you'd like to ask a question through your microphone, just raise your virtual hand. I suppose I could start us off with a question that I had, and obviously this is not an area of expertise of mine whatsoever, but it felt like that as I was kind of perhaps in the context of this webinar as well, I am very quickly trying to learn kind of how the synthesis of your analysis through those maps that you created, and I was wondering, beyond kind of just using these maps as ways to synthesize the analysis, did you find that as you were creating these maps, that perhaps that was actively also informing some of your prior understanding as well?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it's a way of trying to simplify a lot of complex data. So when you try and draw it out, and it really forces you to think about what might have been, for example, key events or decisions. What I would say is there are a lot of things that we've drawn that never make it into publications. So we just published a piece on the role of international trade union officials. And we tried to kind of draw out the relationship between these different roles in a kind of a diagram. And it just didn't work. In a sense, it kind of complicated things rather than simplified things. So a lot of the time, it's just part of that kind of, how do we analyze data? And you don't think of data analysis as somebody says, well, draw it, and it can be quite a challenge and an interesting thing to do, to try and draw out, what might happen over time, or the process that you need to go through to reach a decision. So we use it both as a way of kind of as you say, synthesizing information, and often saving a lot of words but also giving people a sense of where things are. So, for example, if you publish something on the Highlands and Islands in Scotland, and you talk about a place called Barra, it's very unlikely that your readers know where that is. Barra is actually the only airport, commercial airport, where planes land on a beach. bizarrely. So you know, there's that kind of thing of sometimes you do need a map, a physical map, or some way of representing these things to show how they relate to each other. And in that way, that visual kind of representation, people retain visual information much better than they do the written word. And that's one of the big pluses of this. It actually helps the reader as well to navigate your argument as well.
Right. Fascinating. Thank you. We do now have a question come in the chat who says, really helpful to see a range of visual mapping. Are there particular formats you might recommend for smaller samples, such as in qualitative research?
Yeah, well, I mean, quite often these things start out, you know, for example, our study of the Highlands and Islands Airports Limited. I mean, this was part of a project on that we started just before COVID, looking at remote towers. And a lot of those were quite kind of experimental because, you know, there's a lot of concerns about how, you know, how an air traffic controller can switch from one situation to another. And Highlands and Islands was one of the few that had a concrete kind of proposal. So it was quite an unusual case because it was, you know, it was owned by the Scottish government basically. So we had a really kind of quite a small self-contained case study really that allowed us to really dig into the interests of members of the Scottish Parliament who we interviewed, air traffic controllers, and a lot of these people. The interesting thing that was that in that particular study, it was retired air traffic controllers who took on the task because the air traffic controllers don't really want to get into conflict with management. It's not the kind of job where you want people to be in conflict with the boss. So it's a really interesting kind of process of these, you know, these different groups involved, and then, you know, how do we categorize those as part of the union or the community? And so you have to think about those relationships between different groups of people and kind of trying to draw these things out of, you know, who's involved and who said what. So sometimes it looks like a big mess. It's just lots of kind of bubbles and arrows going before you can kind of condense things down. And that's when you have small case studies, it usually means that you've got a really dense narrative. And it's how you kind of try to simplify that data, because we can, you know, with a small case or an individual case, you can really get into all the kind of transcript and the narrative and interview data, etc. And you can sometimes get lost in that. It's how you kind of go out and then go back in again to try to analyze the data.
Yeah. Cool. The two questions here that I think I will attempt to combine because I think they are relevant. What stage of research do you start trying to visualize your findings? Do you start with pen and paper or use particular software? And again, yeah, if it is software, any good tools you might recommend?
We usually begin with on whiteboards. As I said before, whenever my students have kind of collected all their data, that's usually the first stage when with my PhD students, where I say, right, let's go and draw this out. Because it's usually, you know, in a PhD when you've got a really rich data set, quite often it's how you kind of make sense of that. So that's the kind of first stage of that, where we're just looking at the data, for example, and trying to maybe separate it out into different chapters or whatever it might be within the PhD. And then there's always the thing of once that's done and the chapters are starting to come in, it's then let's look at the whole thing and see how everything kind of hangs together. I'm a pen and paper person. Most of these diagrams have been drawn by my PhD student, so I couldn't say. Well, he's not a PhD student now; he's a professor at the University College Dublin. But he would always be the one who would then get on the software. I'm not sure whether he uses any particular software for this. I actually think doing it on a whiteboard is quite often the easiest thing to do, because when you're both there, you can label things and then just wipe it off and then give it a different label or whatever. So that's the way we usually do these things.
Perfect. Thank you, Pete. Well, I've also seen the slides for the next speaker where I'm aware there's also a lot of craft involved in that kind of mapping. So may I then introduce our next speaker, Zifi Tung, who is a PhD researcher in education at the University of Bath.
Hello. I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, let me just get a timer so I don't go over. Okay. So hi everyone. My name is do this. Ziffy, and I will be sharing with you part of my PhD research. So today, it will be a little bit different from Peter's, where I'm actually using maps, like actual maps. So I'm analyzing visual maps, what teenagers do during break and lunch times. So a little bit about background. So my research is looking at break and lunch times in schools. From my literature review, I have discovered that break and lunch times have been getting progressively shorter. There has been a lot of news articles about how kids are not eating, they're not relaxing and not being outside because of missed break times and shortened break times. And there are a lot of literature out there that talks about how bad that is, as you may all know. So previous research looking at break and lunch times used survey data, but survey data with staff and students, but there are no current studies that engage directly with students through observation and dialogue in schools. And most importantly, there are no policies and legislation on mandatory breaks for students and how long breaks should be. This is in the UK. So why teenagers? Teenagers are often misunderstood, their voices are not heard, and through looking at the literature, there isn't much on teenagers themselves, is usually asking adults and or primary schools. So my study aimed to understand what teenagers do in schools during break times, explore the places and spaces they go, and how policies and school structures affect their choices. So my research questions are basically my aims. They are quite broad because the study was an exploratory study because there wasn't much out there. So I just kind of went in kind of blind and just see what I could find. So my method is map making and observations. So the first phase that's happened before was the very first thing I did. So map making, I asked the school for a map of the school from a bird's eye view. You'll see it in a minute. And I blew it up. I printed out A1 size, so it was massive, and brought it to the school with the map making activity. I brought markers, colored post-it notes, and stickers. And the point of the activity was to understand where and what teenagers do during break and lunch. It was participatory and creative, and it allowed me to, after I'd done the map making, I had the data. It led me to where I would do my observations. So I ended up doing two different types of observations, non-participant, where I was sitting like in the middle of on the side or like in different areas of where they said they were going. So if they said they were at the AstroTurf, I would be there and then I would sit like outside of the AstroTurf and just making notes of whatever I saw. And then I got really lucky to become part of three groups of girls' friend group. So I became part of um, their group, and I have conversations of things they've told me and what they do during break and lunch. So the map making process was a session of 30 minutes, and I was lucky enough to have a 1 hour session with year 8 class. So the map making process was split into three tasks. The first task was they were given a orange post-it note to I would tell them that what are you doing at break what are you doing during break time, write it on the post-it note and then stick it where you are. The same with lunchtime. The second task was place a sticker of where your favorite and least favorite places are. So they were given a happy face and a sad face sticker corresponding to favorite and least favorite place. And then the post-it notes they would write the reasons on it. And the third task was to draw a cross where you're not allowed to go. So, oh yes, and the sample size. So each year I had year 7, 8, 9, 10, and 12. I wasn't able to have access to year 11 and 13s because it was exam period. And each had one group each for each year group, and the gender split was pretty 50-50. So I had 41 participants in total. So these are my findings. So this is a example of one of the maps of the year 8 groups. So you can see it can be a bit messy. It was a bit overwhelming, a lot was happening. But you can see the orange post-it notes. They would write here, talking like over here, and then they would have the lunch purple post-it notes for lunch, and then you could see the stickers, the happy face stickers, and then why, the reason of that, and then the sad face stickers, and put why. And this was completed for all the different year groups. So what I did to analyze these maps was content analysis. So according to the literature, content analysis is a way to determine the presence of certain words, concepts, or themes within qualitative data. This isn't exactly, there are a lot of ways to use content analysis, but I decided to do this because I have previously used content analysis in a different project, and it worked by basically what I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of count where each student were during break and lunch, basically, and what they were doing. And so content analysis fit because I just, yeah, so if you look at the steps for content analysis, you decide on a level of analysis, word, phrases, sentences, or themes. And in my case, it was mainly words and phrases because I wanted to analyze what they wrote on their post-it notes and where they put the post-it notes. Second step is decide on how many concepts to code for, whether it's fixed categories or for flexibility. I didn't know what I was looking for, so I was just open for flexibility. The third step is decide whether to code for existence or frequency. So I will talk a little bit about that after the slide where I will walk you through what I did, and then decide on how to distinguish among concepts. So this is an example for the year 7 group. What and where are you doing at break and lunch? So on this left side, you can see the screenshots of the maps and the post-it notes and stuff. So what I did was I created tables using PowerPoint and distinguished them between break and lunch. And then I put the location and the reason. And the reason section is verbatim. So exactly what they wrote on their post-it note and put it in. And the same as lunch. And then I color coded them. So eating or food was red, friends was blue, and green was games and activities. And then I did the same for favorite and least favorite places. Again, with the place where they put their post-it notes. The reason is what they wrote on the post-it notes. Did the same thing for favorite and least favorite place and color coded them accordingly to my key. So then I decided to I then decided to put all the, so I got the digital version of the map, and for each year group, I did this system where I placed a dot of where each student was, and then I decided to put all of them together onto one big map with all the year groups to ease my analysis. And I did that. It took a long time, but I did that. And why I did that was because I basically just wanted to count how many students were at which locations, to kind of like content analysis, kind of just get an idea and to analyze like where are they during break and lunch. So I did that for breaks, and then you can kind of see with the different colors, the different year groups that occupy different spaces. And it just is like a visual way, and it was easier for me to just count the dots and put it in a table. And I did that for lunch too. Again, it took a long time, but it was worth it. And so these are my findings from counting the dots, basically. So all the locations are on the left side, on anonymized for ethics, reasons, and then we have the year groups on the top. There's 7, 8, 9, 10, and 12. And yeah, and then I just put in, like, counted the dots and put it in the table. And then if you do add up and so part of the content analysis was to see if I count up the total, it's not 41 participants. And then I was racking my brain and I was like, why isn't that the case? It should be all 41 participants. Because some participants put more than one post-it note. Some just, so it's not 41. So that's something that I wasn't expected. So that's where you are during break, and then I did the same thing for where you are during lunch. And so this was just kind of a way for me to analyze the data and to turn the visual data into numerical data. And then I wanted to go further because I needed to do something with the reasons of what they're doing. So I created tables again using PowerPoint. So location A, I put year 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then their direct quotes from their post-it notes. And then this was done for all the locations. And also all the quotes. And so what ended up happening was I counted up and color coded every single post-it note and ended up putting into these 3 categories. So part of the content analysis, one of the steps that mentioned is whether or not you count both. So for example, one of the students who wrote being with, like, I'm with my friends and I'm eating, that would mean 1 for being with friends and 1 with eating. That's why the numbers, again, don't add up to 41. And this particular case also, there was some missing data because of miscommunication. So in the first group of map making, I told them to write what they were doing on the post-it note and then stick it. But then some of the students just put "I'm here" or their name, and like their name and here. So that I couldn't do anything with because that's not a reason. That's just they're there. So that's what I did for break and lunch. And you can see, so being with friends, eating or having food, and then games and activities became football because all the games and activity was football. So that's how I ended up with these 3 categories, and the different numbers is just counting up the post-it notes. So reflections on map making with teenagers. What worked was I was able to obtain data to understand where and what teenagers do during their break times. I had used a predetermined map where there's no pressure on them to draw as the map was already there. There is some literature on that, on whether there are studies done where participants were asked to draw their own maps, but there's always an issue with that, is especially with children or teenagers, it's really hard for them to grasp how to draw their school or like a particular place in such a short time. So I decided to use a predetermined map, and they were able to engage with the task and they were excited to participate. The post-it notes and stickers were a win. They really liked that aspect of ownership. They really, like, they would write their reason and they would stick it on. And especially with the happy face and sad face stickers, they really like thought about it carefully before they stuck it on, because that once you stick it on, you can't take it off again. That was really good. But some of the challenges was that peer influence, something that I didn't expect at all. But now in hindsight, it was gonna happen because it was in a group situation. So you can see one of the images here where all the sad face stickers are in one area. So there were a few in that area, I think 1, and a student was kind of deciding where her least favorite place was, and she was just kind of like, I don't really know. And then she saw there was other students already put it there. So she put it there. And then after a while, because they were all at that same step, they just decided to all put it there and just write like the same reasons. And this was the same with other year groups as well. That was something that's a challenge when it comes to doing it with a group. Another challenge with surface level data. So originally I planned on doing focus group discussions. Like I would have done the map making for like 30 minutes, and then I'll come back again another time with the same group to discuss the maps. But during the sessions, I just tried to like see what was gonna work. I asked some of the students, all the year groups, oh, why did you put that there? And there was like no response. And because part of my research is to have to understand like what they're doing and why. So there was another instance where they put, I'm playing football with my friends on the AstroTurf, and then I wanted to ask them more about it, and things like what does it mean to be with your friends, or like why are you with your friends or something? And they just shrugged and like, I don't know. And they just didn't respond. And then last challenge is missing data due to participants' misunderstanding. And there were some students who didn't want to participate, which was fine. And they just did their own thing. So conclusion for this presentation, mapmaking is a creative tool that can be used to understand the experiences of teenagers in a school setting. It can also be used for any type of like place or space with any kind of participants, but it does really work well with children, teenagers. And there have been studies who've done it with adults as well. Predetermined math was used and allowed students to be engaged. The small post-it notes and stickers gave participants freedom and choice. So the analysis itself, it allowed me to turn visual data into numerical data using the tables and color coding made each post-it note keeping track of each post-it note much easier. So when I analyzed, I could look at all the groups. So I put all the tables onto one page, and I could just kind of see that actually they were all just kind of the same thing, and that's how I categorized them into the 3 categories. And because I did this first, it gave me a better understanding of what students do and which spaces they occupy. So for example, like the canteen was one of the most popular places. So one of the days when I went to observe, I went to the canteen, and just to kind of see like, are the participants that told me they'd be there are there, and then what else is going on there. And then finally having a different type of data that supports my observational data. So that's the end of my presentation. Any questions, anything, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Stevie. Very candid, I think, presentation on what could go wrong, and certainly kind of how you then overcome that. I think that's, lots of little nuggets of wisdom there for us to pick up on. While we wait for questions to come in the chat, you may be pleased to know there's an invitation to connect from one of our audience members who works at a non-profit. I'll make sure to send you that contact.
Oh, that's great because I need jobs. I'm graduating soon and I need some. No, I was just gonna say before I ended, if anybody, and I didn't expect so many people to be here, if anyone works on schools, break and lunch, food insecurity, gender inequality, like anything, because this is just part of my very small part, like 10-20% of my data. I have like 80% of my other data is just stories, is of conversations of me and friendship group, a 4 year 10 girls group. So I was with them for like 10 days, and I have so much conversation. And so if anyone wants, if any, like, no matter where you are, like if you need help, like I have references, I can send you things, and like we can just connect, and like I can help anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That will have to be for another webinar, that other part of your research. That's fantastic. We've got a post with 3 questions. Although if I can be greedy, can I ask mine first? Which is um, so when I imagine kind of your stereotypical teenager, they perhaps when they're given a task to do particularly at school, the responses that you got almost would be the ones that I would expect from those who are less enthusiastic or those who perhaps want to, I don't know, challenge authority a little bit. Um, and so my question is, and I suppose this kind of can apply to other kind of informant groups as well beyond school children. But when you do encounter informants that perhaps either aren't that willing to participate in these more hands-on activities, or they just don't really understand the point of it, have you been able to find ways to kind of help them understand what's going on, why their input matters, and kind of get that contribution from them?
I think I was really lucky because I had a sense that it was the first time they were being listened to. They were like really eager because I think it was the first time that somebody that's not a teacher, that's not affiliate, like I told them from the start that I'm working with the head teacher and the school, but your voice matters and they won't know who wrote what because it'll be anonymized. Even though the head teacher knew like which students participated in which group, I didn't, when I reported back to the school of um the data, I didn't name any names. And also the thing is that the map making didn't like this part, it seemed great, but like it was just it is like very shallow data. It's just like data that shows where they are and what they do. But that's not enough because I needed to dig deeper and to kind of understand like more about what they do. So um I tried, like originally I planned to do focus group discussions, but it just wasn't working because they just wouldn't tell me anything. And then I realized that it was in a formal setting. So how it worked was the head teacher would pick kids out from their PSHE lessons, like 5 or 6 of them, and they'd come with me, like go to their class and then come with me and then go back to their class. So it was still like in a formal classroom. Whereas when I was outside, like I was literally just wandering around, just sitting somewhere and just watching like the students and making notes. Students would come up to me and they'll talk to me. And of course, I'm like, whatever you say, I'll record, but I won't put your names down and I'm allowed to be here and just be honest with me. And I would start the conversation with, is there anything you want to tell me about the school? And that usually just like opens the floodgates. Like they just tell me everything because they've never been um, heard before.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow, fantastic. So there really is value in the identity of a researcher then almost that kind
Yeah.
of outsider and then the
Yeah.
anonymity side of things as well. Yeah, perfect. Before I go to the question that we did get, I've just posted a link to a survey, just very helpful for us to make sure that we're delivering the right training for you. So participants, if you'd like to respond to that, it would be really, really helpful for us. And obviously another link to see what other sessions we've got later on in the series. Celine's asked us, well, a few questions. Firstly, how did you select the school? How did the school respond to the research? And I suppose thinking kind of more widely the fact that there are other elements to this research, what will this be used for?
So yeah, I was lucky enough to, I'm not sure if you've heard of the Brilliant Club. And it's a great charity that employs PhD students as tutors to less disadvantaged schools. So I was able to be placed with this particular school. And while I was there, I formed kind of a connection with one of the teacher that was part of this program because it's like the charity works with the school and there's like a lead teacher there. And I talked to her and she put me in touch with the head teacher and I framed it in a way that's like I want to collaborate with you and to kind of not just for my own research, but I will also ask the students and frame it as, what do you want to tell me about the school? So the head teacher was very interested as well because he doesn't know what the teenagers think. And to see, because they are a very proud school and they think they're doing great, and it is a really good school. But with me in the picture, I can hear the honest opinions of, they're not gonna like the things that I have. There is a paper coming out, but the things that I've had, the teenagers won't tell anybody else. They won't tell their parents. They won't tell teachers. They tell each other. But I'm there, which is very interesting. I got really lucky. Also, what was the other question? So I did write a report for the school, just like an initial report after my they were really happy. He was really interested, and he was very happy with the results. I did also point out some issues and some things that he could like the students were saying, and he was very happy to hear and is happy to take in consideration of my findings and try to improve the school. What would this be used for? I'm still This is a very good question. I'm hoping to, this is just like a little bit, again, a little bit of my data. Some of the things that came out was I was very taken aback of, there weren't a lot of kids eating. Like looking at the table of reasons, um, I expected that most of the students would be at the canteen at lunch times because that's when you have lunch and that's where the food is. But there's actually not like more than half of the students weren't there. And it kind of, there are a lot of issues and things that came out that I didn't expect. And so there are two of the key issues that came out. One of them is that students are hungry, and the queuing is a really big problem. Like students avoid eating because the queue is too long. So that's something that I'm trying to like raise awareness about. And at the same time, the astroturf was all from the map making. So this is an example of how map making helped my observations. From the map making, I noticed that all the students that put their at the astroturf were boys. So I was like, surely that's not true. It's 2025. Like, there must be girls. So I went to the astroturf to kind of prove that point and be like, this is not true. Like, they've made a mistake. But it was true. And I was like, gosh. And then I met the year 10 girls and year 11 girls, and they've told me like they have nowhere to go, and the astroturf is only for boys. And that spiraled into a whole thing. And I have written a paper, it's coming out, about the inequalities. I can't believe it because it's 2026 now, and it's still. And I did talk to the head teacher about it. And his response was like, yeah, the boys play football. That's what they do. And the girls just sit and chat. And I'm not, and that's just how it is. Like, that's not the issue with him, but it's the society. And so that's something that I kind of hoping to next steps is to, because I only did one school. So I'm really hoping, and it's in southwest of England, and it's quite rural. So I'm really hoping somehow, somewhere, if I could get a funding, I could repeat the study or do similar in different schools to see if the issue is same or different. And then there's also like an all-girl school could be very different. So that's
Right.
like a lot could be
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah. And thank you. And I know we're out of time now, but just very, very quickly, if you can, there's a question on did you kind of focus on autistic children or other neurodivergent students? Was there a difference?
Unfortunately, no. I think again, the study is I would say it's more like a case study. I didn't get assigned any students with neurodivergent, but I'll be very happy to look into that. But I think it's just more convenient for the school. Like they just picked random students and maybe they didn't want to include, yeah, that's a decision that they made.
Right. Fair enough. Thank you. So the slide, and someone in the comment has asked for the slides, particularly with the references. The slides will be shared after
Yeah.
this session, so do look out for that. I'll be sending that through email. But that is time. Thank you ever so much to Pete, and thank you so much to Zifi for those fantastic presentations. Definitely a very kind of nice breadth of topics there explored. And thank you so much to everyone who has attended today as well. And we hope to see you at our next session, which will be in a month's time. Right. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.